Society of the Middle East, the Caucasus and Central Asia, and advisor to BirdLife International's Middle East Division, which he established in 1994. He was made BirdLife Member of Honor in 2013 for his work in Yemen and Iraq. He first went to Turkey in 1966, surveying wetlands, and that autumn with others counted the raptors migrating through the Bosphorus, the first comprehensive count of raptor migration at a site in the Old World. He worked for RSPB for many years, from 1968 to 1999, and then for BirdLife International, particularly in the Middle East. His Birds of the Middle East was translated into an Arabic guide by Abdul Rahman al-Shihan al-Nazi of Kuwait, one of Arabia's leading ornithologists. And it's worth noting that such was Abdul Rahman's commitment to conservation that he made the translation as a personal, voluntary contribution to our understanding of birds. Together with Jens Eriksson, Richard also published the Birds of Oman in the Helm Field Guides and the Birds of the United Arab Emirates with Simon Aspinall. And today he will talk about the island of Socotra. And before Richard starts, can everyone please mute their microphones? And if you want to ask any questions, put them in the chat and then we'll gather them up at the end of the talk. All right, thank you very much. Richard, over to you, please.
Okay, thanks very much, John. Now, I've just got to find my talk. If you give me 1 second. I'm going to open it now. Let's see what I do here. Can you help me, Janet? You're not seeing anything yet, are you?
No. The share screen button, the green share screen button, middle bottom of your screen. Just press that and then choose the PowerPoint. That needs to be open first on your desktop.
Yeah, it is open, and so are we there?
We're getting there. Yeah, we're there.
And so I'll do this as a slideshow. I think that's how I do it. How does that look? Are you seeing that?
Sorry,
Yeah,
lovely.
brilliant.
Sorry? Are you seeing that?
Yes, brilliant.
Very good.
Okay, right. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation, Janet, John, for allowing me to talk about an island that I love and that I've got to know well over many years, but sadly haven't been there now for 8 years. So this is on Socotra, its birds, other wildlife and conservation. And I'm going to dedicate it to my Socotran friends. They always love and enjoy their wonderful wildlife heritage. I've made very good friends on Socotra, and fortunately through modern technology, I'm able to keep in touch with them regularly. And today I've had 2 emails from them, young Socotrans who are interested in helping their environment. Now, I expect you all know where Socotra is, but just in case you don't, it's an island complex it's owned by Yemen. It's a Yemen island, and it's about 300 or so kilometers south of the Yemen mainland and just off the Horn of Africa. And if we were on a Portuguese boat in the 1500s, this is what we might have painted. This is done by one of the Portuguese sea captains, an image of the island of Socotra, and you'd recognize it today easily if you arrive by boat. And about this time, a very famous person, a very famous sea admiral called Tristan da Cunha visited Socotra, and of course then went on to name the Tristan da Cunha and its islands in the mid-Atlantic. So that's how the Portuguese saw Socotra in the mid-1500s. A little bit about the island. It's about 100 by 300 kilometers. The highest peak is 1,500 meters. Population of over 40,000. That's a missing naught there. And winds in the summer monsoon of over 100 kilometers an hour. And just a few scenes from Socotra, just to give a flavour of the island and its habitats. These are the central mountains, the Hagias in the background, with the world famous dragon blood tree, which is Yemen's national tree. It's got a mosaic of montane vegetation, particularly on the higher slopes, and then dropping down to the coastal plain with its low salt tolerant vegetation against the edge of the foothills. It's got a few estuaries and freshwater lagoons, not many, but of course these attract a lot of birds, like any water does. And there's sea cliffs for nesting seabirds, which I'll be mentioning. And of course, a very rich marine environment. And it's always interesting. We often forget about the sea, and because it's just water, and we don't realize, or at least many people don't realize, just how rich it is under there and how an important environment it is, and one that needs as much protection as the land-based habitats. So Socotra is rich in endemism. There's 307 endemic plants of 14 endemic genera, and I'm sure that others in the audience, Alan Forrest, for example, will correct me if I'm wrong. 40 endemic butterflies and moths, 20 endemic reptiles, 12 endemic birds, and 1 endemic dragonfly. And I will mention the outstanding plant surveys done by the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, because these have really been at the forefront, spearheaded the conservation understanding of Socotra. And this is Tony Miller, who one of the leading botanists in the Middle East, if not the leading botanist in the Middle East, photographing a Socotra caralluma. And the RBGE have determined that there's over 850 species, 307 endemics, which have all been given IUCN conservation status. And this is just a photograph of one of the special trees, the endemic trees, the cucumber tree on Socotra. Their work also determined the number of frankincense species, 8 on Socotra. And we've also got to just mention briefly, before I come on to the birds, just one of the reptiles, the Socotra chameleon, fairly common creature. Now on to Socotra's birds. 223 species have been recorded, 12 endemics, and there is the link to the checklist of the birds of Socotra, but I'll give information on that a bit later. And this is the most complicated slide you'll have to go to sleep through today. You've got 12 endemic breeding birds. 4 are globally threatened in the vulnerable category, and 3 are near threatened. It's got the highest world concentration of the endangered Egyptian vulture. That's the only endangered species of bird on the island. 21 important bird and biodiversity areas, IBAs, have been identified. And the next fact, I think, is one that's worth taking away with you. The number of endemic birds is higher than that of any country in the Middle East, Europe, North Africa, and Central Asia. I mean, this really is a hotspot of endemism. And it's designated as an endemic bird area and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Now onto Socotra's breeding birds. And these breeding bird surveys were carried out largely between 1999 and 2011. And I'm glad that Dave Flum is in the audience today, because he came out to help with these surveys, which was a mixture of people from Britain and the Socotrans themselves, and particularly Ahmed Said Suleiman, and also Omar Al-Sahir from Yemen, who took part in the work to determine the number of species, help in the compilation of an atlas. And all this was done largely by line transects across all habitats, altitudes, across the island, and 384 of them, which helped to determine the breeding bird populations. So what did we learn from these surveys? Well, we learned that the Socotra sparrow was the commonest bird. Not perhaps unsurprisingly, but there it is. And the number of individuals, this was determined by the playing around with the maths from the line surveys, and we calculated and tested those calculations and came up with a figure of over 300,000 sparrows. And we also, as I mentioned, plotted their distribution, plotted the distribution of all the breeding birds. And this is the one for sparrow, the Socotra sparrow. You can see the big dots means where breeding was proven, and the small dots where probably breeding. So a good widespread distribution over widespread habitats. Also breeding on 2 of the outlying islands of Sama and Dasa. And although I haven't got a photograph of it, I will mention another sparrow, the Abdul Kuri sparrow. And down in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see the island of Abdul Kuri, which has its own special sparrow, the Abdul Kuri sparrow. And this is a globally vulnerable species, threatened species, because of the low numbers there. And more worryingly, it is being targeted as a food, for food, because obviously at the moment, times are hard, and there are relatively small numbers of birds, and the sparrow is the commonest one. The Socotra bunting is one of the rarer of the birds on the island, and it's near threatened. We determined nearly 4,000.
Sorry, Richard, could I just interrupt? I think someone's unmuted. Could you all make sure that you're muted, apart from Richard? Thank you.
Okay, already off again then. So the Socotra bunting, globally near threatened, one of the real special birds, and probably one of the most difficult to see of the endemic birds. And here you see its distribution, much more restricted, largely to the higher ground, the cliffs in the west and the south, and particularly in the Hagir Mountains, which is the central block to the east. One of my favorites is the golden winged grosbeak. When I first went to Socotra, this was golden winged grosbeak, but it's now been split into 3 species on the Arabian grosbeak and on the mainland of Yemen, and here on Socotra, the Socotra golden winged grosbeak. Good population, and this is something that surprised me about the endemic birds, that they were all in reasonable numbers and had a good widespread distribution. So although they're endemics, only confined to one island, it was good to see that the populations were pretty healthy. One of the favorites of all, and one of the easiest birds really to see, apart from the sparrow, is the Socotra sunbird. And here it's feeding avidly and feeds on the nectar of many of the flowering plants on the island. And again, a good healthy population and a widespread distribution. I'm not going to be mentioning all the birds. This is just a handful, just to give you a flavour of the breeding birds and the more interesting ones. The Socotra cisticola, with a population of about getting on for 9,000 individuals. And again, this is a globally near threatened species, confined to really the coastal plains with salt tolerant vegetation. And of course, these areas are vulnerable to development pressure. In one of the talks that Janet arranged a few weeks ago that I attended, I think it was Julian who's in the audience, talked about the, I think it was the caterpillar approach, these the developments that were just sort of eating up these wonderful coastal areas. And of course, this is pressure on a number of bird species, in particular the near threatened Socotra cisticola. I mentioned earlier that the Egyptian vulture is the only globally endangered species on Socotra. It's widespread, and the surveys that we've done suggest about 1,900 birds. Here we see them feeding on the remains of a feast, the carcasses of cattle and sheep after a wedding celebration. And this is, as I mentioned, the highest concentration in the world. And if this were to succumb to the veterinary drug diclofenac that I'd mentioned earlier, and I'll mention again briefly in a minute, then of course you'll be wiping out one of the real treasures of the island, for which Socotra has an international responsibility. And then just to finish on the land birds, the Socotra buzzard. When we first went to Socotra back in 1993, this was a buzzard. It was buzzard, buteo, spur. Don't know what it was. People hadn't named it. It was thought perhaps it was a race of the common buzzard. Perhaps it, who knows? Anyway, it was just sort of left hanging in the air, and we decided that, well, this wasn't good enough. Let's start to do some serious work on it, looking at the morphology, vocalizations, breeding seasons, measurements, habits, and also, of course, looking into its DNA. And as a result of this, I, together with a colleague, wrote a paper naming this as the Socotra buzzard, Buteo socotraensis. And it was named in 2010. And what interested me, as much as that, was sitting at home and after a day out in the field and getting a phone call. And I said, oh, hello, who's that? Oh, it's the Guinness Book of Records. Oh, what do you want? Have you got a photograph, please, of the Socotra buzzard? I said, yes, why? I said, well, we've just been looking at your paper in the bulletin of the British Ornithological Club, the Bull BOC, and we'd like to include it in the Guinness Book of Records as the newest bird of prey in the world. Well, yeah, I said, yes, of course, I'm delighted. So I sent the photographs, but what amazed me was that there were people sitting in the Guinness Book of Records office looking at one of the most obscure publications you could ever find in the world, the Bull BOC. But there you are, they did it, and so it's there in the Guinness Book of Records. And just finally on the land birds, the Socotra white-eye, largely through DNA analysis, has been named as the latest endemic species on Socotra, bringing the total number of endemics breeding birds to 12. Now to seabirds, because here we have some internationally important populations, 10 species breed, and rats may be a threat to them. We don't know that, but we do know that rats are present on a number of the islands where they breed. And it is islands where most of the seabirds breed, and you'll see there Calfarun and Sabuna, which are really sea stacks, rocks in the sea, which hold the really big seabird colonies. And here we see Sabunia, which was one of the important islands for breeding seabirds. And I'll just mention briefly a few of them. The Persian shearwater, something like 50% of the world's population breeds on Socotra and its outlying islands. For those of you that know the Manx shearwater in Britain, Western Europe, it's not so dissimilar, but smaller and a much browner upper parts, but can be seen in very, very large numbers feeding off the coast of Socotra, as well as found on the breeding on the islands. The Socotra cormorant, well, there's only about, well, less than 5%, I think, of the world population breeds on Socotra, but it was named Socotra cormorant because the first specimen ever found, collected, was on Socotra, and so it was named the Socotra cormorant. The red-billed tropic bird, wonderful bird, photo taken by my friend Omar Al-Sakir. Something like 12% of the world population breeds on these islands. So these are really important islands for their breeding seabirds. And I think that one of the things that would be worth investigating in terms of conservation is making Socotra a special area for marine protection, a marine protected area. And interestingly, the latest marine protected area that I'm aware of in the world is in the seas around Tristan da Cunha. And as of course I mentioned right at the beginning, it was Tristan da Cunha, who was one of the sea captains who first visited Socotra back in the 15th century. The Junin's petrel. Now this is an interesting bird. Again, when we first went to Socotra, the breeding grounds of this bird were not known. It was just known to be seen out in the seas of around Arabia. There was some suggestion that it might have bred in Oman, but there were question marks about that. So essentially, the breeding grounds were not known. And when we were out there, we were discussing this with several people, and had great help at the time from Miranda Morris, who's so well known as an authority on Socotra. And because of her knowledge of the Socotra language, she was able to talk to people about this seabird and had people seen it. And gradually we built up a picture, and I said, well, look, I reckon that this bird is in fact nesting on these cliffs here. These aren't the actual cliffs, but similar to this. And so I suggested to my Yemeni friends that Socotran friends, that they investigated. I wasn't going to investigate, so up they went. In fact, they didn't go up. They got some of their colleagues to go up, because these people had in fact been visiting these nesting sites, not knowing, of course, that they were Junin's petrels, because they were collecting the fat chicks of the Junin petrel, because they're very, very rich in fat and oils. And so here they went up, and my friend Ahmed Said passed up a camera, and they took this photograph of the Junin's petrel with its egg, the only photograph of a Junin's petrel and its nest ever taken in the world. You can see from the maglite torch in front some idea of the size of the bird. So this was discovered by our Socotran friends in 2000, the first breeding site of this seabird. Winter visitors and migrants to the island. 85 species are regular winter visitors and migrants. The commonest are seabirds and waders. Most passerines, that's small songbirds, are uncommon, and you get sudden invasions. So, as I mentioned, seabirds are really common migrants. And here in the middle, the ones with the orangey yellow bills are lesser crested terns, stopping off probably on their journey from East Africa, the seas off East Africa, to fly up to their breeding islands in the Arabian Gulf. So it's a really important stopover site for seabirds and wading birds. Small birds, the desert wheatear, the surveys that we carried out for breeding birds, we were also able to do some rough calculations on the numbers of other birds wintering, and this is by far the commonest, the desert wheatear, with over 100,000. And these birds are probably coming from, well, they're certainly coming from Eastern Asia, but this bird may well have hatched in China. Blue-cheeked bee-eater, birds like this can suddenly invade the island, and one day in October we recorded over 2,000 just suddenly arrived out of the blue, probably caused by vagaries of the weather systems we didn't understand. But so it's an exciting place for finding some exciting birds. And now on to threats and conservation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on threats because I want to just talk a little bit more about conservation in a minute. But these, as I see it, as far as birds are concerned, and this of course will apply to other taxa, these are the main threats: overgrazing, unsustainable livestock numbers, destruction of woodland, potentially poisoning and pesticides, alien introductions, and unplanned development. So we've just looked at the animal populations. They are seriously high and probably unsustainable. This is something that the Yemen authorities, I believe, should be looking at very seriously. Wood harvesting, okay, wood harvesting is fine when it's dead wood to a limited extent, but when it's wholesale rampaging through some of these wonderful little woodlands, this is going to have a serious impact, not only on birds and other wildlife, but of course on the people, the good people of Socotra themselves. And so the alternative energy sources must be considered to help to reduce this wood harvesting. This is a rat poison that's used on Socotra because there's lots of rats. That's fine. And the way it's used is very sensible. It's used in houses, under the floors and places like that where other wildlife won't get affected by it. And we know from our Socotran friends that this is carefully controlled. But the one thing that would worry us is if the veterinary drug diclofenac, which is now starting to be banned in many places in the world, and several places in the world because of the adverse effect it has, particularly on vultures. Oman recently has banned it. This drug must never be used because it could potentially wipe out the entire Egyptian vulture population, of which Socotra has the highest concentration in the world. The house crow, back in the mid-90s, a couple of house crows arrived on a boat, bred, started to colonize, and fortunately were eradicated after 15 years of colonization. Had they been not been done, then this bird could seriously affect many of the other species, not only of birds, but reptiles and insects on the island. So any introductions are bad news for conservation. Now, conservation achievements. Well, I think one of the main ones was that Socotra was designated as a World Heritage Site in 2008. And because of recent concerns, a review of the status has recently been undertaken by UNESCO, and a number of us I know present in this room have taken part in that, as well as our Socotran friends. In 2008, Yemen also joined the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands of International Importance, and when that happens in a country, they have to have a designated site, and Socotra's Ditwa Lagoon which you can see in the background there, was Yemen's first designated Ramsar site. When the conservation work that was being carried out in the early part of this decade, underneath the banner of the Socotra Conservation and Development Program, I think it was called, a zoning plan was established, and this is a rough copy of it. So red areas are nature sanctuaries, the dappled areas are botanically important areas, and the blue, plain blue, are national park. And I just again want to pay tribute to the work that was done by the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, here in establishing the areas which were botanically important and making this great contribution to the zoning plan. Zoning plan, I think, is in a state of disrepair at the moment, but it is essential for any future conservation of Socotra that this plan is updated and adhered to. And I mentioned again the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, and this is one of the works that stemmed from their studies, the Ethnoflora of Socotra, and by Tony Miller and Miranda Morris. And so, in addition to the plant work, we identified something like 21 important bird and biodiversity areas, IBAs, 17 on the island of Socotra, and as you will see, the rest, virtually all the other islands, are IBAs because of their importance for birds. I won't go into the details of how an IBA is identified, but they are identified by strict objective criteria. And this is a map showing the main island of Socotra with those areas identified. And what you'll see, if you can remember from the previous map, is that the highland regions, the Hagia right in the centre there, at sites 8 through to 10, were really important, and they're also very important botanically as well. So those are the sites that I've identified and which must be integrated into the conservation zoning plan. In terms of awareness, one of the books that was produced together with the RBGE was the Birds and Plants of Socotra, and that was the first wildlife education tool really used on the island. And I think updating that for current use would be an important step. And just personally, from my own point of view, my visits to Socotra were very important for gathering data for this Birds of the Middle East, the second edition, which I did with my late friend Simon Aspinall, and which has also been translated into Arabic, as we heard earlier from John, by Abdul Rahman Al Khan, and is now available as a free to download app. That's the Arabic version for any mobile device. And that is something that I know is being used on Socotra and free of charge to obtain that. During those early periods, under the Darwin Initiative in particular, they were training for ecotourism, and you know, Socotra has unique wildlife opportunities to offer for ecotourism. And then recent conservation actions under the current UNEP Global Environment Facilities Socotra program, which started 4 years ago and is continuing under the banner of the organisational banner of the Royal Society for the Conservation of Nature in Jordan. And under this programme, a database of fisheries was established, also a database for biodiversity and development for conservation planning, mangrove replanting programme, frankincense and dragon blood tree replanting program, vulture awareness events, and wildlife lessons for schools, and a few other things too. So a biodiversity database. Now, this is essential. If you're going to take conservation seriously, you've got to know what you've got. And establishing a database of all biological taxa is vital, be it butterflies, reptiles, plants, or birds. The online atlas to commercial fisheries was developed. I don't know a lot about that, but this early part of the program was overseen by Sengenberg University. They were the managers of the program, and they had a great interest in the marine life. And so this online atlas of commercial fisheries will be, I think, an important tool for sustainable fishing. Two community mangrove nurseries were established. This is a mangrove here. And the reason for this was because a lot of mangroves were destroyed by hurricanes on the island. And mangroves are such an important protective plant for things like tsunamis, as well as being wonderful in their own right for the wildlife that they support. So this has been realised, and this was an important part of the programme, as was nurseries for replanting frankincense and dragon blood trees. I don't know how successful these have been, but dragon blood trees were uprooted, I think, quite seriously by recent hurricanes, and as well as not being regenerated at the rate of which conservationists feel they ought to be, that they need some help. So this, I think these nurseries are experimental, but I think they're going to be a worthwhile part of the future programme under the UNEP Jeff work. Also introduced was rotational grazing site trials. I mentioned earlier that overgrazing is a serious concern, and trialling grazing sites to see if grazing can be undertaken sustainably is an important step, part of that programme. There's been a community shop for nature-based products so that the good people of Socotra can be involved in making money, making a living from their wildlife resources in a sustainable way, so that they can then start to realise how important those natural resources are. 20 environment lessons for children were devised, and I was involved in some of them, and this is one. Lesson 6 was on bird migration, and this was produced under the Socotra Conservation and Sustainable Development Project. And what interested me was that the cause that they wanted more and more of these programs on bird migration. It was the one thing that really, really did fascinate the young people of Socotra. And this is my friend Amit Said using the book that I mentioned earlier on the birds and plants of Socotra to try and help and encourage young children. They also had ran events for celebrating the International Vulture Awareness Day, and these were supported by a number of organisations. The Ornithological Society of the Middle East included, as well as BirdLife International, and they had painting competitions. It's wonderful drawing there of an Egyptian vulture and the sad-looking person and girl on the left-hand side, because of all the plastics and rubbish which are being thrown into the oceans. Certificates for the best artwork were presented, and there was also in these events there was plastic awareness with plastic collection from the beaches, and this is only one of the photographs that I was sent during those days, but the amount of rubbish and plastic that was being collected was really really worrying, and it was great that our Socotran colleagues were realizing that this was an issue that had to be addressed. And then very near the end, I just want to mention a lovely little story which happened purely by chance. Colleagues of mine were undertaking research into the migration of cuckoos in Mongolia. And so they put satellite tags on these cuckoos, and the cuckoos migrated. Initially, they hadn't got a clue where they were going to migrate to. They thought it was going to be south of Mongolia into somewhere into Southeast Asia, but no. From Mongolia, they went towards the west, across India, down into East Africa to winter in East Africa, in the Kenya area. And if you'll notice there, one of the lines goes right the way across the island of Socotra. This is one of the cuckoos that ringed and satellite tagged in Mongolia so that it could be recorded throughout its whole journey by satellite. And so there it is, flying across the island of Socotra in a letter that was written by the young people in school on Mongolia to the children on Socotra. And that letter says, "Dear Socotran school children, how are you? My name is Nimingu. We are delighted to know that Nanja," that's the name of the cuckoo that flew over Socotra, "flew over your special island in the Arabian Sea. It's just amazing to imagine how these little birds went that far. As you may know, these birds get caught in Mongolia, where we live, and fitted with a satellite tag so we could track their long migration. We look forward to seeing these cuckoos back in Mongolia. We send our good wishes." And that was from the high school in Binda village. And the Socotran children replied. And this is just one. There were 6 letters that were sent, and this was one of them, with the Egyptian vulture at the bottom. "To our friends at Binda village schools, my name is Ashraf Saeed. I'm studying in the 2nd year at Khalid bin al-Hahid High School. Thank you for writing to us. We are also amazed by the small bird Nanja for traveling such long distances. We hope Nanja will return safely and fly over Socotra on his way back home to Mongolia. I wish you can visit Socotra one day and see its rare birds and plant species. Below is one of the interesting birds, Egyptian vulture, locally called Suayadu." Wonderful stories from children. And just to finish, anyone interested in learning more about Socotra, the Journal of the Friends of Socotra, TIFE, is well worth reading, produced both in English and in Arabic. And there's a good website too to look at. Recently published, a brave publication in these troubled times, a travel guide to Socotra, published by Bratt Books, and let's hope that things will be improved. It will improve so that tourism can be on the ascendancy once more, because this does help to bring in vital income to the Socotran people. And as far as birds are concerned, the Journal of the Ornithological Society of the Middle East, Sandgrouse, publishes many papers, including those on Socotra's birds. And in the recent issue, my good friend Ahmed Said wrote a paper about the discovery of white-faced whistling ducks, 12 of them, which arrived in January this year, a new record for the Middle East. Future conservation thoughts? Well, support for the current United Nations Global Environment Facility Socotra program, and also the relatively newly emerging Socotra Wildlife Association. Increase in environmental education and awareness, and ensure that biodiversity knowledge is integrated into the conservation zoning plan. That really must be resurrected under the next phase of the UNEP project. And finally, just ensure that diclofenac is never used, as it could wipe out the entire Egyptian population. So just acknowledgements to BirdLife, OSME, Centre for Middle Eastern Plants, that's part of the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, the Environment Protection Authority, and the Darwin Initiative. So thank you very much for listening. And just before I go, I thought I ought to prepare this as it's nearly Christmas. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was really excellent talk. I'm sure everybody enjoyed that very much. Again, one of the problems of having a Zoom call is that we can't all clap, but I'm sure everybody is doing that at home. I'm going to chair the questions. If anybody would like to ask a question in Arabic, then Janet can translate for everybody. And there are some questions already coming up in the chat, which I'll run through in a second. But I'm going to start by asking one of my own to kick the process off. Many years ago, I did some work on the flora of the Horn of Africa with Ib Fries in Copenhagen, and we were looking at patterns of endemism in the area. And one of the things that we found that if you're looking at floras which tend to be written on a national basis, then you don't see endemism of the area as a whole. So obviously Socotra has a lot of island endemics, but if you extended that area to the Horn of Africa and perhaps over to Yemen, does the number of endemics within the region increase substantially?
If you're talking about plants, I'm just wondering whether or not this might be something that Alan could answer, because I might waffle a little bit. But on birds, for example, are they all strict island endemics, or do some of them trickle over into? No, that these are all strictly island endemics. There are a few ones which you might call a bit marginal. I mean, for example, when we first went to Socotra, a bird called the Forbes Watson Swift was thought only to be a Socotran endemic. We've now discovered that it does occur and breed in significant numbers in the Horn of Africa and further down East Africa, and also on the coast of Oman. But all the other birds are strictly endemic. You do, of course, with something like the white-eye, which was recently named as a Socotran endemic, that there's a whole family of white-eyes. It's a real complicated family of birds, and there are many of those both in Yemen, the Horn of Africa, and even in the Yemen populations. They're starting to think about splitting them, because there's a bird that looks white-eye that only occurs in the mangroves, which is possibly going to be a mangrove white-eye at some future stage. But otherwise, they're all very much pure Socotran birds, so to speak. Does that answer your question? Yes, it does. I mean, it's obviously, if you've got those links, they can provide some interesting biogeographical. Absolutely, yes, indeed. Is it a baboon or galador that goes across the Gulf, for example? Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, let's move on. So Deborah has a question here. What land predators exist there apart from humans? What land predators apart from humans? Yeah. Okay, well, now that's an interesting one, because there's no dogs on Socotra. That's and I'm going off at a slight tangent now, but were there dogs on Socotra? Dogs, as we know, can once they go feral, can be a problem. They can be a problem for cattle and other animals. So you want to get rid of them. And how do you get rid of dogs? You put poison out. And of course, poison would be absolutely, the vulture population would disappear instantly. So you haven't got dogs. you've got cats, which are, but not really large numbers of cats. And I've only seen a feral cat once or twice outside of the main towns of Hadibu and Kalansia. So they're not really a problem. Rats, and we think rats could be a problem for seabirds on the islands where we know they might be established on one or two. For example, on the island of Darsa, we know there's lots of rats, and that's probably why the seabird population isn't as good as it is on those wonderful sea stacks, which of course would be rat-free. Having said that, there are no mammals apart from bats. These are natural mammals apart from bats, I think the odd shrew, and also introduced civets, the civet cat. And we know that the civet cat can be a predator, quite a vicious predator of birds. And I've seen them go along a roadside and find a nest of one of the endemic birds, the Socotra warbler, and just rip it out and eat the young that we were monitoring in it. Having said that, a general statement would be that apart from man, mammals are not a serious threat to wildlife.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed, Richard. Interesting about the shrews. How did they get there? And of course, in Wallace's line, shrews is one of the indicators. But on to the next question. One here from Mark. Is there any sense of prevailing indigenous ideas about an attitude towards the use of the Socotrian environment?
I'm not certain. Can you say that one again? Because it needs a bit of thought.
Okay, is there any sense of prevailing indigenous ideas about an attitude towards use of the Socotrian environment? Mark, you can elaborate if...
Yes, I was interested to know whether they had pre-existing notions that their resources are limited and whether they practiced measures that showed they were aware of those limits to their environment.
Yeah, well, I think that just coming from a purely bird point of view, and with a considerable help that was given to me by Miranda Morris when she was translating Socotri. Socotri is a spoken language, not a written language. She speaks it, I believe she's fluent in it. It may even be her first language now. She was looking at poetry of Socotran people, and it showed a real interest and concern about their wildlife heritage. And there was wonderful poems about vultures, for example, and how how they were thought of as being important for the protection of the environment, cleaning up things, and all the stories about them they weren't regarded as witches or anything like that. They were regarded as good creatures that that the Scotri people wanted to look after. Going back to a step back, obviously the pressures that have come on the Socotran environment have all come about in the last 50 or so years, or probably even 20 or so years. And there's been this sudden realization, probably, well, we know that by the young people of Socotra, our environment is precious, but there's lots of pressures coming onto the island that we can't do anything about, development. I can remember, this isn't answering your question, but it's kind of giving an interesting aspect of it. I was giving some lectures with my friend Omar Al-Sa'ir in Yemen about 20 years ago, and I was talking to a school in Taiz, and one of the things that I was talking about was how pristine Yemen was, and how we ruined Britain, you know, with the development. I was, you know, trying to keep things very simple. So, you know, with uncontrolled developments and things like that. And this girl said, that was a very interesting talk, Mr. Porter. Thank you very much. And I sort of nodded, and she said, and you said that our country is really wonderful, but in your own country of Britain, things are you know, things have been destroyed. And I said, yes. Well, why don't you stay in Britain and help them? And why are you coming over here? And I thought, well, it really made me, actually, it's sort of a kind of a wake-up call to say, well, make sure you don't start telling people what to do. Empower them if you can by helping them to understand what they've got, but don't start telling them. And yeah, nice story, wasn't it?
Janet, we're up against time now. Shall we continue for a little bit longer, or?
Yeah, we can continue for longer. We're not really up against time.
Okay, that's great. Dana, yeah, you had a question about COVID-19. Do you want to elaborate that a little bit? Oh, sorry, Deborah. Deborah asked, do we know whether, and if so, how bird populations are being affected by COVID-19? I'm not sure if I fully understand that. Deborah, do you want to?
Just to say that I've been reading a few studies on different animal populations, and they're showing that some of them are being affected by COVID-19. And I didn't know if there's any bird studies this past year that our speaker is aware of, because he's a leading bird researcher and luminary. Thank you.
But I'm not aware, actually. No, I'm not aware at all of anything that on Socotra itself. And indeed, I think with the level of knowledge and expertise on the island, this probably wouldn't be spotted anyway. And I'm actually not aware that it's a major issue anywhere. Perhaps
no, I understand that. I understand that. It's just was thinking with all the migration of birds in particular, apart from marine life, birds migrate very long distances, and if any of them were carriers,
well, that's true. That's true, and certainly birds are carriers of avian flu, and so we do know that, but I don't think it's an issue that conservation needs to worry about.
Well, I'll tell you why I'm asking the question is that I'm an Antarctic specialist, and when the cruise ships went to Antarctica, they were quarantined because they contracted COVID, and they're going back to the Antarctic. And so the question is, in some of the other sort of forums that I'm in, they're asking, can the humans transfer it to penguins, for example? And it could, you know, we just don't simply, I don't think we know its effect on animal populations. But I was just wondering if you've heard of any research on it.
I haven't, but of course we do know that COVID can transfer from animals to man, because that's how it happened in the first place. But the interactions between animals that might carry the virus and other animals, I'm not aware of, and I'm certainly not aware of any of COVID being carried by or transmitted by birds. But maybe others could help us here. Anybody knows anything?
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on. Thank you very much, Deborah. Let's move on to the next question, which is from Neil. What sustains the vultures, people, goats? Which I guess, you know, if you've only got bats and shrews, then vultures won't have anything to eat in the natural fauna.
Well, okay, I can only talk about the situation now. Celebrating big events and weddings and occasions like that means that you're going to put out lovely feast of goats, cattle, whatever. So slaughtering of goats, slaughtering of sheep, slaughtering of cows, the miniature cows. Once they're eaten, the carcass is left out and the vultures zoom down. And I've seen as many as 200 on the feasting on the remains of a wedding celebration. When you travel around the island, as soon as you stop and get out anything that looks like food, like getting out a cooking pot and starting a fire, and that vultures will be round you and walking around you within 2 feet of you. The people in Hadibu and Calansia, the main towns, any unwanted food, the result of breakfast, lunch or supper, is put out in the walls of the house and the vultures just come down. And so you see a typical scene looking over Socotra, looking over Hadibu in the morning, would be vultures sitting on low rooftops and walls waiting for the food to be put out. So there's this dependency on man, and also the people wanting to help the vultures. So it's a real sort of almost symbiotic relationship in some sort of crude way. And the vultures, of course, help to tidy up and get rid of all the unwanted things. They are in fact called, I think, in Socotra, the municipal bird, which I think sort of sums up the way the Socotrans think about them. What happened, what the situation was 500 years ago, when there wasn't so many people on Socotra, and presumably there wasn't the roaming animals, sheep and goats and cattle that there are now, I don't know. But that's something that I'm just not, I just haven't looked into, but it would be a fascinating study.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed for that very interesting question and answer. Another question just come in, which I think should be our last one, as we're going a little bit over time. And it's quite a controversial one, so some other people might be interested to come into this. And that's recently the Arab coalition have control over Socotra. Would this political interference form a threat to the environment of the island? And I certainly know that there is a lot of discussion about that threat at the moment, but there's probably people in the audience can provide a bit of information. But over to you, Richard, first.
Okay, yeah, well, it is a difficult one. It's a controversial one. And one of the things as a conservationist that I've always wanted to try and be guided by was not getting involved in politics, but just being there to provide helpful, hopefully, information and advice that, in this case, our Socotran friends can use for the management and of their own island, because it comes that little quote that I gave from the Yemeni girl saying, you know, why don't you stay in Britain and look after Britain, sort of brings that point home to you. But it's very complicated at the moment, and of course not only is the Arab coalition, but also the United Arab Emirates are starting to have a foothold on the island, and we really don't know whether that's going to be for conservation good or bad, because it's going to bring a lot of development pressure, that's for sure, but it also could bring some Western views on support for conservation and money to support for conservation. I just don't know. I don't know. As you mentioned, John, other people in the audience might have a view on this one, but
yeah, I mean, I think we might be in danger of being here all night if we kick that one off. Does anybody else want to have a succinct comment on the changes in political regime or political pressures in Socotra and their impact on the environment. Okay, everybody's being very sensible.
Absolutely wise, yes.
Okay. Then I think it remains just to give you very heartfelt thanks from Selkie and all the audience